Wyoming Territory. June 1887, the train hissed and groaned as it pulled away from the dusty platform in Rawlins, steam curling like ghosts into the pale morning sky. Zadie Darnell stood on the wooden planks, her valise clutched tight in her gloved hand. Eyes fixed down the track as the final car disappeared into the horizon along with the man who had promised to marry her. He had not even looked back. 3 hours earlier, they had stepped off the train together. He had said he wanted to stretch his legs, maybe get some fresh water, then he vanished. Now the train was gone too. She was alone, just like that. Zadie did not cry. She held herself still, her spine straight, chin high. But her eyes were wide and stunned, like someone shot through the chest and still standing. She had come all the way from Illinois, left everything behind. For nothing down the platform, a tall cowboy leaned against a post watching her. He had seen it all, the man leaving her, the train leaving her, the way she did not fall apart, even when she probably should have. His name was Thayer Vance, and he had ridden into town to sell 2 horses and take the train back east to see his sister. But something about the woman in the dark blue traveling dress too fine for this dusty place, with lace at the collar and a hat pinned, just so made him stay where he was. She had not moved in 10 minutes. Thayer pushed off the post and walked toward her, his boots steady on the wood. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "You all right?" Zadie blinked, looking up at him like she had not heard a voice in days. I am fine, you sure? Because I saw what happened and it did not look fine." Her lips pressed together. "I will manage." Thayer nodded slowly, then looked out at the empty tracks. "He leave you here on purpose?" She hesitated. "He said he was going into the freight office. I suppose I should have known better." Thayer glanced at her suitcase. "You got anyone coming for you?" "No." "You got anywhere to go?" Silence. He let out a breath. "You got a name?" "Zadie Darnell." "I'm Thayer Vance." They stood there for a moment, the wind tugging gently at her skirts. A dog barked somewhere beyond the rail yard. The station agent had gone inside. Finally, Thayer spoke again. "I'll take you home if you'll let me." Zadie's eyes flicked up. "What?" "I have a wagon just outside of town and a cabin about a day's drive west. It is quiet out there, safe. You can stay as long as you need. Or just until you get where you're going." "I do not have anywhere I am going." Thayer nodded. "Then you can come with me." She stared at him. "You do not even know me." "I know you did not deserve to be left like that," he said simply. Zadie looked down at her hands, then out at the empty platform again. Slowly, she nodded. "All right." The sun was high when they turned off the main road, wagon wheels bumping down a narrow trail lined with cottonwoods. Thayer drove while Zadie sat beside him, quiet, her hands folded in her lap. She had not asked many questions, and he had not pushed her to speak. She looked tired, not just from the travel, but from something deeper. He stole a glance at her. Her dress was still neat, but her shoulders were slumped now, like the weight of what had happened was finally settling in. "How far is your cabin?" she asked softly. "Not far now. Maybe another hour." She nodded, then looked out over the hills where antelope grazed in the distance. "It is beautiful here." "Yeah," he said. "It is." When they reached the cabin, the sky was turning gold. It was a small place, made of pine logs with a wide porch and a split-rail fence around the front. Smoke curled from the chimney he had asked his neighbor to light the stove earlier in the day. Thayer helped her down from the wagon, then carried her valise inside. The cabin was warm and clean, simple but comfortable. One bed, a rocking chair, a table with 2 chairs and a small shelf of books. The kitchen corner had a stove and a pump and a few dishes neatly stacked. "I will sleep out in the barn," Thayer said, setting her suitcase down near the bed. "You take the cabin." Zadie turned toward him. "You do not have to do that, I know, but I will." She looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Thank you." He tipped his hat. "I will be close if you need anything." The next morning, Thayer brought in eggs and coffee. Zadie looked more rested, her hair braided back from her face. She had washed and changed into a plain dress from her bag. They ate in silence for a while until she finally asked, "Why did you help me?" Thayer sipped his coffee. "Because I would want someone to do the same for my sister if she was in trouble." Zadie looked down at her plate. "I was supposed to marry him. We had written letters for a year. He said he loved me. He is a fool." Her throat tightened. "I sold everything to come here." Thayer reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "You are not alone here." She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. His eyes were steady and kind. Rough hands calloused. A man who worked hard and spoke plain. She felt something settle in her chest, something warm and quiet. "Thank you," she whispered. Over the next few days she stayed, helped with the hens, rayed on the porch, sewed by the fire in the evenings. Thayer never pushed, never asked more than she wanted to share. But little by little, she did tell him things. Her father died 2 years ago. Her mother passed the winter before last. She had been alone for a long time before that man promised her a new life. "I was so tired of being alone," she said one night by the fire. Thayer looked at her from his chair. "You are not alone anymore." She met his gaze. "I know." A week later, he asked her to ride with him to check on some fence posts. She mounted the mare he saddled for her, skirts tucked neatly, and followed him across the hills. At the top of a ridge they stopped. Below, the valley stretched out like something from a dream. Pines, silver rivers, and far-off mountains. Zadie turned toward him. "I have not felt this peaceful in years." "You belong in a place like this," he said. Her eyes met his. "Maybe I do." He reached for her hand. She let him take it. They rode back slower than they came. By the second week, Thayer no longer slept in the barn. They still kept separate rooms. He had moved a cot into the barn and left the cabin to her, but the way he looked at her had changed, and the way she looked at him had too. One night after supper, they walked out under the stars. The sky was endless, and the air smelled like pine. Zadie stopped beside the fence, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. "I never thought I would feel safe again." He stood beside her. "You are safe now." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I know." And then, slowly, she reached up and touched his face. He leaned down, his hand warm at her back, and kissed her. It was not rushed. It was not uncertain. It felt like coming home. By late June, the meadow behind Thayer's cabin had burst into bloom, dotted with blue flax and wild lupine. The cattle grazed slow and content along the far slope, and the creek that cut through the lower pasture ran cold and clear. Zadie had begun rising early, stepping barefoot across the plank floor to draw water while the sky was still lilac from dawn. She moved with steady purpose now, not as someone uncertain of her place. Thayer came in one morning from tending a downed fence post, his shirt damp at the collar, a coil of wire slung over one shoulder. Zadie was slicing bread at the table, her sleeves rolled and a white apron tied snug around her waist. She looked up as he stepped in. "You seen the north gate?" he asked, setting down the wire spool. "Not in a few days," she replied, brushing crumbs into her palm. "Is it dragging again?" "Worse." "Elk got through and snapped the top rail. Might need to lay fresh timber." He poured himself a dipper of water and drank, eyes on her the whole time. "You mind coming with me this afternoon? I could use another set of hands." She nodded once. "Of course." They rode out after the midday meal, her skirts tucked clean over the saddle, a hammer and nails stowed in the pack behind her. The sun bore down sharp, and the air smelled of sun-warmed pine and dust. They didn't speak for a while, just the clop of hooves and the soft creak of leather between them. When they reached the broken gate, she dismounted and crouched beside the splintered wood. Her fingers traced the jagged edge where the rail had split. "How long has it been since you lost stock?" she asked without looking up. "Last spring. Cougar took a yearling, haven't had trouble since." She stood. "You run this place alone, mostly. Neighbor helps with branding." "I trade labor when it's needed." Zadie picked up the hammer, weighed it in her hand. "You ever think about hiring someone more permanent?" Thayer leaned against a post, arms folded. "Only if they could read cattle and fix a gate without complaint." She met his eyes. "Well, I can read and I don't much complain." He gave a quiet laugh, low and genuine. "That's so." She lifted the hammer. "Watch me." They worked side by side until the light slanted long. Zadie held the rails as Thayer nailed them in place, her face streaked with dust, hair coming loose beneath her hat. When the last nail was driven, she stepped back to admire the work. "Sturdy," she said, brushing off her palms. "Thanks to you." As they mounted to ride home, clouds gathered low over the ridge. Thunder rumbled faintly to the west and Thayer clicked to his horse. "Best hurry," he said. "Storm's coming quick." Rain caught them halfway back. Heavy drops spattered down, darkening their sleeves and soaking the path. Thayer slowed at a bend and lifted his coat from the saddle roll, handing it out to her. "You'll need it more than I will." "I'm already wet," she said, but took it anyway, slipping it around her shoulders. They reached the cabin as lightning cracked behind the trees. Inside, they peeled off boots and hung clothes near the stove. Zadie toweled her hair and Thayer lit a lamp, the glow softening the corners of the room. She stood by the window, watching the rain. "I never liked storms as a child." "Too loud?" he asked. She shook her head. "Too sudden. They reminded me how fast things can change." He stirred the fire, then sat on the hearth. "Not all change is bad." She turned, the lamplight catching the curve of her cheek. "No. I suppose not." Later, as the storm rolled east and the wind gentled, she joined him near the fire with a book from his shelf. She read aloud for a while, her voice steady, low. He listened, one knee drawn up, his gaze never leaving her. When she paused, he asked, "You ever think about staying?" She set the book in her lap. "I've thought about little else." Thayer leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I don't want to rush you, but I need you to know this isn't charity. I brought you here because something in me already trusted you." Zadie's breath caught, but she didn't look away. "I didn't come here to be pitied. I came because you offered me a choice, and I chose you." He stood slowly, walking to where she sat. Kneeling, he took her hand. "Then stay. For good, not just for shelter." She reached for his face, fingers light against the stubble along his jaw. "I want that, I want this." He kissed her without hesitation this time. Not tentative, not questioning, just sure. The fire burned low behind them, but neither of them noticed. The scent of lilacs drifted in from the thicket near the well, their bloom stubborn and late for the season. Zadie stood beside the porch rail with her fingers curled around a tin mug of cooled coffee, watching a pair of jays fight over something shiny in the grass. The wind had softened since the storm, and the air felt washed, like the world had been rinsed clean and left out to dry. Inside, Thayer was mending a saddle strap with slow, practiced movements. His brow was furrowed in concentration, but he glanced up when she stepped through the door. "You feel like going into town tomorrow?" he asked, threading the needle through stiff leather. She set the mug down. "For what?" "Supplies. And I thought maybe you'd want to stop at the land office." She walked toward the table. "Why the land office?" He looked up, eyes steady. "There's a parcel east of the pasture line, flat and green. It's still unclaimed. I thought you might want it in your name, for something of your own." Zadie was quiet for a long moment. "You'd give that to me. I'd help you file for it. That's not the same as giving." "You'd own it outright." "What would I even do with land? Plant, build, keep bees if you want, or nothing at all, just know it's yours." She sat down across from him. "You think about these things long before you say them, don't you?" "I do." Her hand rested on the table, fingers brushing the worn grain. "I'd like that, to have something that can't be taken." He nodded once, then returned to the saddle strap. They left just after sunrise the next morning, riding side by side down the wagon track until the cottonwoods gave way to open country. The town was still stretching to life when they arrived, the blacksmith's forge just beginning to glow, and a boy sweeping dust from the boardwalk outside the mercantile. Thayer held her horse as she dismounted, then handed her the list he'd written in pencil on the back of a used envelope. "I'll load the grain while you get the rest." She took it, nodding. "Meet you at the mill, just after noon." Zadie moved through the mercantile with quiet purpose, choosing carefully and speaking plainly to the clerk, who watched her with a puzzled kindness. He was used to women passing through, not settling in. When she asked for window muslin and a hammer of her own, he raised a brow but said nothing. At the land office, the clerk was older, with a long scar down one cheek and a pair of half-moon spectacles perched low on his nose. Thayer waited near the door while Zadie signed her name in a ledger thick with calloused dreams and failed claims. Afterward, she stepped out into the sunlight, holding the deed in both hands. She looked at it for a long time before speaking. "I didn't think I'd feel different," she said. "But I do." Thayer adjusted his coat. "You should. It's not just paper. It's a beginning." They ate together on a bench behind the gristmill, sharing bread and a wedge of hard cheese. Zadie leaned back against the warm wood, watching the wind stir up wheat chaff around their boots. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," she said, brushing crumbs from her lap. He chewed slowly, then looked out over the creek. "I used to sleep with a pistol under my pillow. After the war, when I came back, couldn't rest without it for near 2 years. She didn't flinch or frown. "And now I keep it in the drawer, still loaded, but I sleep fine." She nodded, then picked at a splinter along the bench edge. "I used to pretend I was someone else when I walked to school, just for the length of the road, someone braver. Someone who didn't feel like her clothes were borrowed." He didn't interrupt her silence. "I don't do that anymore," she said. "Not since I got off that train." He looked at her then, not as if searching for anything, but as if he'd found it already. "Good." They rode home in a slower rhythm, the wagon filled with flour, salt, and a bolt of blue cloth she hadn't mentioned to him yet. He didn't ask. She had already started cutting patterns for curtains in her mind. That evening, she laid the deed flat on the table and weighed down its corners with river stones. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, hands on the edge of the wood, as if anchoring herself to something that finally wouldn't move beneath her. Thayer stepped in from the barn, brushing hay from his sleeves. "You hungry?" "Not yet." He crossed to her side, looked down at the name inked in her tight, careful script. "I meant what I said," she said, back at the bench. "I don't pretend anymore. I know. I want to build something here. With me." She turned to him fully. "Yes." He reached for her hand, calloused fingers curling around hers. "Then let's start." By mid-July, the days had grown long and hot, the kind of heat that made the flies lazy and the trees still. Zadie kept her hair braided up off her neck and soaked her handkerchief in cool water from the creek before pinning it beneath her collar. The curtains she'd sewn from the bolt of blue cotton now hung in the cabin windows, and in the afternoons, light filtered through them in soft, drowsy patterns across the floor. Thayer had begun clearing a stretch of land beyond the east field, where the soil was dark and gave under his boot heel. He worked with a slow precision, pausing often to rest his back or sharpen a blade, and Zadie sometimes joined him, hauling stones into a pile or marking the line of the fence with lengths of twine. One evening, After the sun had dipped behind the ridge and the crickets hummed low, they sat on the porch with their boots off, and their feet resting on the cool boards. Zadie held a cup of water between her palms and watched a kestrel circle in the distance. "You ever think about going back east?" she asked, not turning her head. Thayer scratched at the worn edge of the porch rail. "Not anymore." "Why not? What I have is here." She nodded, then glanced sideways. "I used to imagine I'd live in the city. I thought being surrounded by people might make me feel less spare. Did it? No, it made the quiet louder." Thayer didn't answer right away. The air was soft with the scent of sage and sun-warmed pine. "You think you'll miss that kind of noise?" he asked. "I don't. I never liked it, if I'm honest. I liked the idea of it, not the sound itself." He shifted slightly, drawing one knee up. "Zadie, if you ever wanted more than this, more than me and fences and a patch of ground, I'd understand." She looked at him then, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "You think I'd leave? I think folks sometimes need things they don't expect." "I did. I needed you." Her voice was quiet but certain. He watched her for a long moment before nodding once. "Then we're square." A few days later, a letter arrived from Cheyenne, carried by a rail rider who stopped at the station just north of town. Thayer returned from fetching it with dust on his hat and a thoughtful look in his eye. He handed the envelope to Zadie across the kitchen table. "It's from my sister," he said. "She's coming out." Zadie held the letter without opening it. "To visit, to stay. Says she's tired of boarding houses and shop windows." Zadie ran her thumb across the flap. "Will she want the cabin? She'll want her own place, I reckon. But she's not set on anything yet." He watched her carefully. "You all right with her coming?" "I'm more than all right. I want to meet her." The next morning, Zadie dusted the mantel and aired the linens without needing to be asked. That afternoon, she walked out to the parcel she now owned, measuring it in quiet steps, counting the distance from the creek to the tree line. She stood there for a long while, eyes narrowed against the sun, and when she finally turned back toward the cabin, her face was lit with the kind of calm that came after a decision. That night, they sat at the table with their plates cleared and the lamp burning low, and she reached across to touch his wrist. "I want to build something simple," she said. "One room, maybe a loft, a stove that doesn't smoke, and a place for wildflowers near the door." He set his hand over hers. "You won't build it alone." "I don't plan to." The next week, they began hauling timber from a neighbor's downed barn. Thayer cut and planed, and Zadie helped mark the lines where the joists would sit. They worked in rhythm, not needing to talk much, each knowing when the other needed a hand or a rest. One morning, as they raised the first post together, the light caught her wrist as she steadied the beam, and Thayer looked at her like he was seeing something he'd been waiting his whole life to find. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he asked. She met his gaze. "Say it out loud." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a narrow ring of hammered silver, smooth and simple. "I want to marry you, Zadie, not out of debt or rescue, just because I want to build a life with you that starts from here." She didn't cry. She didn't waver. She held out her hand. "Then start it." He slipped the ring on her finger. It caught the sun and held it. They didn't kiss right then. They just stood there, side by side, with the beam fixed between them and the sound of the wind moving through the grass like a promise. The morning of Thayer's sister's arrival came with a high wind off the ridgeline, carrying the scent of dry earth and pine pitch. Zadie stood at the workbench inside her half-framed cabin, smoothing a strip of window trim with slow, even strokes of sandpaper. The walls had gone up 2 days prior, and the roof beams just the evening before. It wasn't finished, not by a long stretch, but the shape was there now, her shape, and that steadied her. Thayer stepped through the open doorway, brushing flakes of sawdust from his sleeves. "Wagon's about an hour out," he said. "I saw the dust line cutting east." Zadie looked up from her work. "You nervous?" He leaned against the post nearest the door, the sun casting a sharp line down his shoulder. "About her liking it here?" "No, about her liking me after 5 years away." "A little." Zadie set the sandpaper aside and crossed to him. "She'll know the measure of you the moment she sees this place." He looked around the frame, then at her. "She'll know more when she sees you." The wagon arrived just past midday, pulled by a rangy bay mare and driven by a freckled man with a long jaw and a cautious eye. Thayer's sister, Miriam Vance, climbed down without help, her skirts travel worn and a bit rumpled, her hair pinned and repinned against the wind. She was older than Zadie by a few years, with the same narrow jaw as Thayer and a voice that carried without force. "So this is where you've landed," she said, scanning the valley with a thoughtful gaze. Thayer nodded. "It is." Miriam turned to Zadie. "You must be the one he wrote about, Zadie." Zadie stepped forward, unsure whether to offer her hand or not. "I am." Miriam took it without hesitation. "You've got kind eyes." "He never said that." They laughed just a little, and the tension folded into something lighter. Over the next days, Miriam settled into the spare cabin of a neighbor who'd gone to care for kin in Nebraska. She unpacked slowly, asking no questions of Thayer she didn't need answered, and spent her mornings walking the fence lines with a notebook tucked beneath her arm. She was quiet, but not distant, and Zadie found herself drawn to her company in the late afternoons, when the sun turned the hills gold and the breeze settled toward stillness. One day near the end of the week, Miriam paused beside the rows of wildflowers Zadie had begun transplanting near the cabin's front step. "You plant them for color or for company?" Zadie wiped her hands on her apron. "Maybe both. They'll take if the soil's deep enough. I dug twice as far as I needed. I wasn't taking chances." Miriam looked at her, head tilted slightly. "You're not afraid of hard work. I was raised on it. Then you'll do fine here." That night, after Miriam had returned to her borrowed cabin and the moon hung pale and round over the pasture, Thayer and Zadie sat on the floor of the half-built cabin, back against the wall, knees drawn up. The wood still smelled raw, full of sap and sun. "I want to finish it before the first frost," she said. "We will. I want to fill it with things that matter, not many things. Just ones that mean something." He reached into the pouch he kept tucked in his saddlebag and pulled out a small cloth bundle. "I've been holding on to this for the right time." She opened it carefully. Inside lay a brooch, silver filigree with a piece of green glass at the center. Not expensive, but finely made and worn smooth at the edges. "It was my mother's," he said. "She wore it on Sundays when she wanted to remember who she'd been before the war." Zadie turned it over in her palm. "I want you to wear it the day we marry." She looked up, her voice low. "Then I'll have something that matters." They wed on a warm September morning beneath the cottonwoods near the creek. Miriam stood beside Zadie, smoothing the hem of her borrowed dress and tucking a sprig of yarrow into her braid. Thayer trimmed his beard and wore a clean shirt, and when the preacher spoke the final words, he didn't look away from her even once. They had no audience but the trees and the wind. And that was enough. Autumn came slow that year, the hills holding their green longer than usual. Zadie's cabin stood finished by the end of October, her curtains sewn from a bolt of calico gifted by Miriam, her shelves lined with jars of preserves, and a single worn book of poems she'd found at the mercantile on a whim. She didn't move in alone. Thayer's boots stood beside hers by the door, and his coat hung from the peg near the stove. They kept the old cabin for guests and storage, but their life began in the one they built together. Miriam stayed through the winter, then claimed a parcel of her own just south of the ridge. She didn't say much about her plans, but her hands were steadier when she wrote, and she smiled more often. That spring, Zadie planted her first garden: onions, beans, and a patch of tobacco for trade. Thayer built her a bench from the leftover pine, and they sat there in the evenings, her head on his shoulder, watching the sky turn violet behind the hills. They never spoke of the man who left her on the Rawlins platform. He had no place in the life they made. Years passed. Fences wore down and were mended. Calves were born in the cold and survived. The wildflowers returned each April like a promise kept, and Zadie never needed to pretend to be anyone else again. They grew older in the quiet way of people who had nothing to prove. And they stayed in love not with loud words or grand gestures, but with hands that never stopped reaching for each other, even when the days were long and the work hard. And when they sat together on the porch, fingers laced and eyes on the land they'd claimed, it was clear to anyone who saw them that they'd earned every inch of their peace.